Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Catechumens Depart. You've been greeted by Maggie and Annie here, so they say hello in their doggy voices. I'm Eric Anderson again, and
Father Mark Kozak from Assumption of the Holy Virgin Mary Church in South Philadelphia.
oh yeah. Again, welcome back, guys. It's good to virtually see you. Thanks for joining us. Last week we talked a bit about the Renaissance in art. We talked about sort of the humanism that came from that. We talked about the Enlightenment. We kind of touched on the Protestant Reformation and loosely worked our way up to about the 18th century, at which point we tapped out because then we started thinking about the Industrial Revolution, and that was too much for one show. I did want to go back to the Renaissance for just a moment, because there's something in that term itself that I forgot to point out. A Renaissance implies renewal. The use of that term, renewal, is actually, like we talked about last week, a lot of what they were doing was resurrecting ideas from Rome and Greece. So there is implicit in the use of that term an idea that all of the Middle Ages were stagnant. The term actually, if you're my age, was that we called it the Dark Ages when we were learning, right? Like nothing happened, nothing happened there. Until the Renaissance, it was just, boring static icons and, peasants, and I don't know what they were doing, but it wasn't
Dark.
anything. It was dark.
It was dark.
It was dark. It was ignorant. It was backward. And then came the Renaissance. We rediscovered Roman and Greek ideals and then moved toward a humanistic idea of what the world should be about. And so in that itself actually exists some of a seed of the idea that we have in the modern context of progress as over and against the past. Like the past was less, the past was dumb, ignorant, whatever, and we're constantly on this upward trajectory, and that actually starts to kind of take hold in the term Renaissance. And I should have pointed that out last week, and I didn't, so now I just did.
Because there was no Dark Ages.
Right.
They've discovered that now.
Yeah.
Of course, I knew that 35 years ago when I got my bachelor's in history, that there really wasn't a Dark Ages. I wouldn't put aside the Book of Kells and the art of the Irish and missionary work of Irish monastics and monasteries that went out into much of Europe, Western Europe. Wouldn't put down Charlemagne and his accomplishments, except for, of course, being elected emperor, but we won't get into that. We talked about that like 3 times ago.
We did.
But many, many things happened in the West that really added to the Renaissance. It was a part of the Renaissance. It was the foundation of the Renaissance, along with, of course, we talked about last time the contribution of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the refugees that came over when the empire collapsed. So yes, it is a faux part of history to say Dark Ages, because it really wasn't dark and it wasn't an age.
Right.
So
it contained within it a different worldview that we have inherited, which is arguably a lot less dark than maybe some of what we have now.
Yeah.
I could go way down the art rabbit hole, but I'm not going to go all the way down that. It will bore people to tears.
Oh, well,
Or isn't that what we're here for?
Yes, well, or something.
Something. Yes. Oh, wait. Okay, so let's sort of then pick back up where we kind of left off. I think we were kind of beginning to touch on the end of the Reformation, end, if it ever ends. The beginning, the sort of beginning of the industrial changes that sprung from what you saw in the Enlightenment with the beginning of the natural sciences, the beginning of the idea that you could step back and look at the world objectively, that the world wasn't necessarily imbued with God. It didn't point towards God. It was something that could be observed from the outside. So that sort of thinking then naturally leads into a lot of the scientific progress or whatever that happens in the Industrial Revolution.
And also of equal importance that we don't talk directly in the Orthodox Church. We do it indirectly a lot, but it was during this time that the whole idea of stewardship of the world, which is part of our jobs as human beings, that is gone. Now we control the world. It is ours to control and to dominate. It is ours.
Yeah.
Instead of being made by God, it is ours to control. And this will add to what happens with the dark side of the Industrial Revolution, and of course will bring about what happened in the 20th century.
I was reading a really interesting analysis. The Master and His Emissary is the name of the book, and I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. But I was reading an interesting article about that today, and he's a neuroscientist, and he was talking about the over-dominance of the analytical left brain in our world and how that developed. It's about control. And it got me kind of thinking about how interesting that is, because you think of the Cartesian split, right? The I think, therefore I am that Descartes says, which separates the thought from the intuition. And so we've got the control versus the more intuitive side of our being. And even in art that happened, because art became much less about symbol, metaphor, pointing towards the transcendent, and much more representative, naturalistic, based in the physical, observable world.
And in the East, that never happened.
Right.
So in the East, you had the icon, which has nothing to do with computers. It has nothing to do with the word iconic, which is used by every news person and journalist in America, and unfortunately, even the BBC has used that word. It has to do with the holy images that came from the church starting from the 2nd and 3rd century that are created today in our churches, that are beyond works of art and portraits of saints and events of Christ's life and the life of the Virgin Mary, but transcend that, and they become windows into heaven. But that existed in the West too. But it faded.
Right. It grows, it weakens, and eventually, well, it's dead now. I mean, now.
Well, I think there's some embers there. And we'll talk about that later on.
Yeah, well, we're not there yet.
I think there's still some embers there.
Okay. Well, let's sort of talk about then maybe how the Enlightenment thought movement sort of leads into the developments of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, steam power and all of that type of deal, and how sort of walk us through what that looked like. And
we could spend hours and hours talking about the time of discovery and the time of Voltaire and the good side of the Enlightenment. We have a person, I was just thinking of him, here in his adopted city of Philadelphia, Ben Franklin, not the $100 bill, all right, the real man. And this is someone that didn't really want political office. He wanted to make things. and make things better for people. That was his life's work.
Yeah.
Rather than most of the founding fathers wanted to control and wanted to have something better for their state or their region or the new United States, he wanted to make stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that connects him to the past in an important way.
It's why he's the most fun one to study when you're a kid, right?
Yeah.
Like, nobody is very interested in, at least I wasn't, like Thomas Jefferson, who's that? But you got Ben Franklin out there with his kite and the key and getting shocked and all this like exciting fun stuff. But that references a more enchanted view of reality from maybe an older time.
I think so. I think it also connects what strains that we have concerning the better part of the Enlightenment, which is not a lot. The Enlightenment basically failed.
Mm-hmm.
And in the United States, of course, it developed its political tone. In the French Revolution, it developed its radical political destructive tone.
Yeah.
And then in the mid 1800s, there were more revolutions to come. Mm-hmm. And war after war and fighting, and there were major wars during those times. But you add in colonization and East meeting West, and there's so many things that sort of all come together in the 19th century that we've lost control. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that the old Christian empire world controlled things, but there were limits. There was mystery. There were saints that you knew when they walked by. This was the beginning of what became civil religion in the West, and the beginning of the loss of religion in the West. So you read literature from the 17th and 18th century, God is still present in the West. If you start reading in the 19th century and the 20th century, God is not present. And then all of a sudden in 1964, of course, it was announced in the newspapers God was dead. And that was probably not a joke for a lot of people. There are, exceptions to this. One is my favorite English author, Jane Austen, who was the daughter of an Anglican minister, the sister of an Anglican minister, the granddaughter of an Anglican minister, who wrote these 6 gems of stories that had to do with silly ministers. Some were silly, some weren't, but God was always there. Mm-hmm. And what the Enlightenment did was attempt to break that.
Yeah.
And that's really the question that we have to ask here. How did that happen? What happened? And then we need really to talk objectively about the truth of what happened in the 20th century and what continues to happen now in the 21st century, right now as we speak.
Yeah, today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you say that the Enlightenment failed, and like as I understand it, that seems true, but my understanding is not the greatest. So maybe you could help us unpack like what you mean when you say that. Like, what do you feel like were kind of the stated or unstated goals of the Enlightenment?
Well,
and how has that come unraveled?
In a simplistic way, let's go back to Candide and written by Voltaire. Yeah. I thought the world was sugar cake, for so my master said, but now I'll teach my hands to bake my loaf of daily bread. We're neither sure nor wise nor good, but do the best we know. We'll build our house and chop our wood and make our garden grow. This is the simple part of the Enlightenment. Then, of course, if you want to nationalize this, You have by Blake, Jerusalem, which is my favorite non-Orthodox hymn. You know, it's just one of the greatest pieces of music and poetry, but it's pure enlightenment.
Okay.
The Declaration of Independence and its in the Constitution, its dichotomy, its robustness in so many things, but then having all of those who are African American and owned by others be 3/5 of a person.
Right.
Liberty and justice for all, only if you were a male over a certain age and you owned a certain amount of land or had money, then you were franchised.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't get the women's vote until the 1920s. The Native Americans couldn't vote until the 1924. The African Americans couldn't freely vote. Well, sometimes they can freely vote right now, but they couldn't freely vote until the 1960s. And
Which is like last week historically.
Which is last week historically, you know, and these are all connected together with a failed experiment. We're not making our garden grow, and everything isn't peachy.
Mm-hmm. Do you just think it's like that's basically like the anthropology is flawed at the outset?
Yeah.
Like the understanding of what human beings are and what we're like. And
yeah, and then on the other hand, we have people that discover things, and then of course they pay the consequences of. Captain Cook is one of the great explorers of the late 18th century, and of course he dies at the hands of the native Hawaiians because of a misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm.
Darwin, along with the creationists, neither of them have it right.
Right.
They're both wrong. But no one got up and said, hey, wait a minute. Neither of these two theories are right.
Mm-hmm.
Both groups ran with it instead of objectively looking at it and saying, okay, let's test this. Let's look at this.
Mm-hmm.
Let's spend some time on this. Creation is rather important. How things work is important. I mean, look how well they did with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution itself was a success.
Mm-hmm.
We ourselves are here right now because of the electronic part of the Industrial Revolution. That's the only reason why we're sitting here right now.
Yeah, sometimes I think about that, like how weird it is, right? This little thing here is compressing all of this into ones and zeros and like shooting it through the air somehow. And
so we can't say the Industrial Revolution was evil.
Right.
Was it evil to work 9-year-old boys and put them in mines for 12 hours every day, 6 days a week and Sundays off? Yes.
Yeah.
Was it illegal to put pre-adolescent women in various clothing mills and everything and have them work 14 hours a day? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of making something, getting back to Benjamin Franklin, was not a bad idea.
Right.
It's just that we went overboard and we became in love with it, and then of course that led to the ultimate horror of our 20th century and our 21st century. We made them into gods. The whole idea of the Industrial Revolution into God, of progress into God, of evolution into God, of all these things that surround us as fallen human beings into God. And this is where we make the primary theological mistake, is limiting God in this particular way. There was an out, but we didn't listen to it.
How's that?
And the out was a number of authors that came out of the latter part of the 19th and 20th century. One was very, very famous. He had to do with Bilbo and Frodo and Sam and all these guys. His name was J.R.R. Tolkien. He was a professor, and and he wrote an essay in 1935 about subcreation. And he was talking about writing as subcreation, but he was really talking about man and woman as a sub-creator.
Right.
Made in the image and likeness of God.
Yeah.
He was a very devout Roman Catholic, very close friend of C.S. Lewis's, involved with C.S. Lewis's conversion back to Christianity. It was spot on. He got it, but he was a voice crying in the wilderness.
Yeah, he and Lewis both. I mean, but they had witnessed the horrors, the horrors of mechanized war, which pretty quickly came from the Industrial Revolution. Like, here's a mill, here's a machine gun.
Right. Here's a mill, here's a machine gun.
And then you have trench warfare and gas.
Winston Churchill, one of the greatest politicians of all time, was one of the inventors of the tank. We mustard gassed tens of thousands of people.
Right.
We'll never know how many people died in World War I.
No.
And then more horrors come. But the idea is that it's all unraveling. And I think a lot of people were spectators of this because they didn't understand what was going on. So
currently or previously or
currently
both?
And previously.
Yeah.
Because they kept buying into it more and more and more and more until not God is lost. God doesn't. That's another great fallacy. God is lost. No, God doesn't go anywhere in that sense. So your theology is skewed, and that's really what it comes down to. One of I think it was Thomas Merton wrote about the darkness of the soul and how everything is lost in despair and everything else. Everything isn't lost in despair.
No.
That's not how it works. It's the other way around. We get lost.
We get lost, right. Lewis talks about that pretty clearly. I can't remember where.
I think in his book on grief. And then the greatest, some of the greatest examples that Lewis has is in his space trilogy.
Oh, yeah.
About who God is and who the devil is and how the fallen man reacts to these realities interestingly in a different world, but no one reads the space trilogy, and
that's because that hideous strength is tough going.
Well, that hideous strength is weird.
It's awesome. It's the abolition of man, except it's just a narrative form.
And Merlin is in it too, which is very cool.
Which is cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the point is that man can fall as far as, and I'm forgetting the professor's name, the one who falls. Oh boy, this is really bad.
Weston.
Thank you. Weston falls and be possessed by the devil. And man can rise as far as Ransom did. Right.
But the curious thing in the space trilogy, which I think is again why Lewis is so good, is that Weston is possessed not through like pursuing the occult or pursuing anything explicitly like demonic.
No.
It's that he's pursuing progress. He's like, we're going to take man into space and we're going to triumph and conquer, and that is what ultimately turns him into a demonically possessed.
Right.
He calls him the unman, I think, in Pearlandra.
He's called the unman, so which means he's the unhuman being.
Right.
And he's the guy that tries to convince the Eve of this new world, Pearlandra, that she needs to break what God told her to do. Oh no, you don't need to do that, And then there's this list of things. It's fallen humanity again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we can get by on that one. We can sort of squibble on that one a little bit. And that one, no. In the West, absolutes were almost destroyed. In the East, they remain. Have we lived with horrible things? Yes, in the East.
Yeah.
Have we done really stupid things? Yes, we have. But our continuity with the holy tradition of the faith, with the mysteries of God, with the fathers and mothers of the church. I mean, we produced in years, well before the Roman Catholic Church did, a native priest within a generation.
In America, you mean?
In America.
Right, up in Alaska.
In Alaska.
Yeah.
And then we had a string of native priests, not one, but 10, 20 from different families and everything. And Alaska remained, the majority part of the natives remain Orthodox today because of their work and their disciples' work. It was a conglomerate.
A conglomerate?
It was a group work. Sorry. Boy, we're having one of those days, aren't we?
We are. Well, and we're unedited and uncut,
And
so you get it all. Sorry, guys.
That's right. And you're going to get everything. Yeah, there's the dog's mouth.
And there's the dog, and
But
it's big budget.
The point here I'm trying to say is that in the Near East, and Metropolitan Kallistos Ware's book on the Great Church in Captivity just explained this beautifully. The church is under the thumb of the Ottoman Empire, of the state. I mean, and there's persecution after persecution after persecution until the 1800s. Greece gets its independence in the 1820s, and then Romania is formed in the 1870s. Bulgaria gets its independence, and Serbia gets its independence. So from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So these become national Orthodox churches, but they had all been under the Turk for 400 years.
Whew. I forget that empire
Which
lasted
is why
that long.
you have a Bosnia. Why are the Serbs so upset about Bosnia 10, 15 years ago? Because Bosnia was part of Serbia for 500 years. And Bosnia is a holy place to the Serbs. What they did there to the Muslims, women and children, and was horrible. But remember the history. Don't forget the history of, in the 1200s, the Turks were at the door of Vienna. That's how close the Turks were. So in the Near East, what we now call Turkey, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Orthodoxy remained, but was second and third and fourth class citizens.
Yeah.
And many hundreds of thousands of Orthodox Christians became Muslims for various reasons, some to remain alive and to save their children and their not their faith, but themselves.
Their lives, yeah.
Their lives. The Janissaries themselves, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Janissaries. They were the crack troops. They were the Marine Corps of the Ottoman Empire. The Turks would go into a Greek village or a Syrian or a Lebanese village and take out all the young men between the ages of 12 and 16 and take them to Constantinople and indoctrinate them and turn them into Muslims, and they became the crack troops for the Ottoman Sultan. So much of the heart was taken out of those places at that time.
Wow.
So that's the story of that part of the Eastern Orthodox experience. Did good things go on in other places? Yeah. We had a basically well-done missionary expansion into Siberia and eventually Alaska. This was not done in the Western style necessarily, This was done at first by fur traders. St. Jacob, the first native-born Alaskan priest, Orthodox priest. His father was a Russian fur trader that fell in love with the chief's daughter from the island of Atka and married her. Not married her like married her and then the next island.
Yeah.
No, married her. He was married and she became Orthodox. He was married. They were married, and then they had these 4 children that were a part of the Russian American system. And one of them became a saint, which was extraordinary. It just absolutely extraordinary. A little bit before this, one of St. Jacob's mentor and fellow workers, a young priest named Father John, goes from Irkutsk on a little trip, 3,000 miles, with his wife, his 3 children, his pregnant wife, his 3 children, his mother-in-law, and his brother, and goes to Unalaska in 826. And he, along with St. Jacob, make the written Aleut language, missionize thousands and thousands of people, and then he goes to Siberia, becomes the archbishop there, goes to Moscow to become the metropolitan there, and he's venerated as ours here in America, but he was really the greatest missionary of the 19th century.
Oh, nice.
And we hardly ever talk about it.
Yeah.
We don't read about him. We don't read about his life. We don't read about his trouble with his one son that kept running away all the time and wouldn't pay attention to his father. I mean, his father was a living saint, really. Come on. His daughter, the nun, and the whole, there's a whole richness of Orthodoxy in what's now Russia, but also there was a lot of pain and anguish too. The government, as we had talked about last time, the government had made the church into a department, like it was in the West. You have you have your interior department, you have your war department, you have your church department, and it was controlled that way. Education was controlled that way. An important aspect of education of clergy in Russia in the 18th and 19th century, it was basically until the end of the 19th century, it was the best they had. The Russians had. It was a clergy caste, which meant that if you were a clergyman, your children would be clergymen, and you would marry the daughter of a clergyman. But your sons would go to not a great school, but a relatively good school, and they were the seeds of the universities and the academies for other subjects in Imperial Russia, were these priest kids that came out that didn't become priests. They were also the seeds of the nihilists and the early socialists and the early communists, including people like of the 20th century Joseph Stalin, who was a failed seminarian.
Oof.
Yeah.
I want to pause there because we're at about half an hour now.
So sorry I got into all that.
No, I want to actually probably go into that more and give you a little, because that's, hopefully we can sort of like compare and contrast like what's going on in the West, and like
we'll take a look again. I think at the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
We have to talk about that before World War I, World War II.
Yeah.
Especially here in America, and then what happened in Europe.
And then what happened in Europe and Russia, and
and religiously, especially what happened in Europe religiously, and now what's happening. There's a major religious movement being made right now in America that's unknown.
Yeah.
So
we'll chew through as much of that as possible next time.
Sounds good.
Cool. Thank you, Father Mark, as always.
Thank you, sir. It's always a pleasure.
Everyone, thank you again for joining us. We will see you again next week, and until then, catechumens depart.